This book, I had books that went along with me for the journey, for sure. One of them, Azarine mentioned at the beginning, was The Palm Wine Drinker's Son by Amos Tutuola. He was a Nigerian writer, really quite an extraordinary writer who, in some ways, invented a language to tell these Yoruba folk tales that he had grown up with. And I suppose to a certain extent invented some of the details of those tales as well. And he was much criticized in his day, especially in the early going, by fellow African writers because he was writing in what they accused him of creating as a kind of pidgin, unusual language. And one of his great defenders was Chinua Achebe, who said that he was doing something that was unusual and startling and striking and should be supported. But at any rate, his book highly influenced, especially the reading tonight when I was telling those tales that are in this book. I was kind of focusing on those to a certain extent tonight. And while you won't find those in Tutuola's work, I think you will feel that if you encounter his work, that there's a similar flavor there. So that was certainly one of the books I was reading. I read quite a number of freedom and captivity narratives. One in particular, Harriet Jacobs, who wrote a really extraordinary, heart-wrenching, of course, account of her time in slavery and then escaping. But that was terrifically important to me as I was reading this. And certainly this book, the small firecracker that the whole thing exploded out of was, as I mentioned this earlier when I was talking to Azarine's class, page 11 of The Known World by Edward P. Jones recounts an anecdote that's very similar to the one that sits at the center of Kainwan, in which a woman living in the hinterlands with her husband and 2 slaves, and one day the husband comes up dead. It's not explained why, under what circumstances. And the 2 slaves enslave her. And then the anecdote stops in Edward P. Jones' The Known World and is never mentioned again. But I got very interested in what would happen if this woman, 50 years later, told her version of what had happened then. And then subsequently, what would happen if at least one of the young women who had turned the tables on her were given a chance to speak. And so they speak in this book. And then there were others too. Any questions? Yeah.
I really just adore the titles you put on your works, and as someone who has trouble coming up with good titles for my own stuff, I was wondering, do they come as bubble forms naturally, or do you have a process to decide what you're going to title one of your works?
Oh, well, thanks. Titles are really hard. They're really hard. And for me, it's been a real combination of experiences. A novel that I was talking about with Steve earlier, Indiana, went through about a year-long process of trying to find a title. And it got to the point where I was writing titles on the board and asking my classes what they thought to vote, and they were just all thumbs down, this terrible, there isn't a single good title that you've put up, etc. And it had been called something for a long time, which was little better than a sort of work in progress, really. It wasn't helpful. But that had sort of gotten into my head. And so I really didn't know what to call the thing. And the publisher at Coffee House Press said, "Oh, well, I always just thought it was called Indiana." And I thought, well, that's sort of okay. But I hate it too, just calling it Indiana. But then there was a juncture in the text where one character says Indiana, and then the next one picks up with Indiana, so it's part of a conversation, actually, those 2 words. So just to say that was this process, and I was never terribly happy with that, what happened, but that became the title. In Kainwan's case, the title was there at the same instant that I had the idea for writing the novel. And it's a reference both to multiple gestures of kindness throughout the book, these small acts of kindness, and there are different candidates for the kind one of the title within the novel. And of course it also refers to the Furies of ancient Greek legend, who were known as the kindly ones. So they have this double standing. So that was there right from the beginning. I've just been in a title battle for the next novel that was resolved in my favor, I was happy to say. So the book had a title also from the start, the next novel, which is about a young woman who disguises herself as a man who goes to fight in the Civil War for the Union. So this title was there all along, and now with a different publisher, the publisher immediately said, yes, but of course we're going to have to change the title. So I went through about 2 months of coming up with alternatives that were shot down, etc. And then a big fromage at the publishing house decided that in fact she liked the original title. And so it's going to have the original title, despite all of the tearing out. So just, there are all these different ways that this happens. And sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's difficult for different reasons. The impossibly was there right from the start also. For a while it was called the So Impossibly, but too many people were saying the So. And that's like everybody says like now. At that period it was so. Everything was so extraordinary. We should, everybody, for the next couple of days, insert so when you're going to say like and see what happens. Any other questions? Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your personal writing process? Like, so what do you spend writing each day, and then how can you motivate yourself when you're
It's funny, I was just thinking about this. For some reason, it popped into my mind some article I'd read when I was getting started out writing. And you're kind of flailing about, right? You're sort of like, what model should I follow, and what's the best one? And then you think about what your particular hero of the day or the week did, and that's the way it should be. But I was thinking of this guy, I don't even know who the writer was, but his counsel was that the way to be a writer was to put your ass in a chair and keep it there for at least 10 hours a day. And I dutifully followed that, but my butt got really sore really quickly. I've never been able, I've never been able to be one of those writers who sits down for many hours. And I have dear friends who that's how they do it every day. This is almost like going to work. But for quite a number of years, as we mentioned, I worked at the United Nations and I had no time whatsoever. 60 or 70 hours a week, and I was often on call to go in to work, and so I wrote in scraps of paper on the bus, and I wrote when I at lunch breaks, and I cultivated this idea, probably just a pretty illusion, that I was writing when I wasn't writing, when I was working. It was just in my head churning and so forth. But I think eventually you do have to start using some implement to put it down on paper. These days, I tend to work on multiple projects at once, and to work with great fury for short periods of time, maybe a week or 2 weeks, every spare moment, and then I let it sit for a while, a few weeks or a month or however long it is, and then I go back to it. But I find suddenly the pages piling up that way. So I think it really is about finding your own way to do this, and it's tempting to think, well, Virginia Woolf did it this way, or James Joyce did it that way. Just remember they were all mad, brilliant and mad, and they had their own particularities, as will you, everyone here.
So the structure in the Paris story, and then obviously in the Kind one, it's like radically different. I was wondering how, like, you could explain kind of the process between where you kind of like have some shorter chapter sentences with lots of space, like almost like poetry, like prose poetry, and then to this more like multiple narrator kind of thing in the Kind one. You could explain your process kind of.
Is it really well informed? I don't know. This is unusual. I was chatting with Steve earlier about India and Indiana, which was actually, even though it was my second published novel, it was my first drafted novel. And he was asking about the question sort of prose poetry and how my work seemed quite informed, I suppose, by poetry. And that Paris Stories, Indiana, than The Impossibly. And I cut my teeth as a writer by reading poetry almost exclusively. And my first publications were in journals, poetry journals, like Talisman and Sulphur and other places. But having said that, I always thought of myself as a fiction writer. So even when I would write a four-line prose piece, heavy on parataxis and with no punctuation whatsoever, I thought I was writing a short story. My wife was always disabusing me of this notion. She's a poet and knows wherever she speaks. That in fact it was not; these were not short stories. And so, but you know, I reckoned when I was really getting started that poetry had as much or more to teach me about how to be a fiction writer, which was always my passion, than did reading novels and stories, etc. Just the attention to language, to the line, to what a page could be. I think Charles Olson's projective verse is an extraordinary document for fiction writers to pay attention to, and to think about the use of the page, etc. And you know, one can carry that along and continue with that, or you know, my sense has always been to do what the books seem to call me to do. So I've never had well, now I must write more traditional fiction, or now this project is going to be more exploratory. It's just been what the books have asked me to do, and so the Paris Stories, they were asking me to do different things than the books that came after. I don't see myself at all on a kind of path to normalcy, even if I'm exploring these questions revolving around slavery, the Civil War, etc. These 19th centuries questions that continue to unravel and unfurl. I'm also working on work that looks much more like actually the Paris Stories, writing stories again, story essays in a way. So yeah, it's always been about what the work is asked, rather than what I'm asking of it, I guess.
We've already had a few questions about sustaining aesthetic, but I have a particular question. I guess something that I have to face a lot of times when I'm writing is if you're trying to, like in your case, you're obviously dealing with a kind of the vague or vatic, like Americana aesthetic that you're trying to keep throughout. Is there ever a time for you when, like, so to speak, the muse takes a lunch break or something, and you just get stuck there, and you're not sure, like the words aren't coming, and you're not sure quite how to express it, or if you're using the totally wrong, like, kind of tenor of verbiage? Like, how do you fix that? Do you free write or something?
A big part of it is how far I'm into the project. And generally what I've discovered is if I'm early on something and I start to have those blocks, it tends to mean that that's not what I should be working on. And I have a lot of things that are abandoned because I've hit that early. But if I hit that later, I typically, because of the fact that at one point I had those three early novels and the book of stories, actually, Paris Stories, all floating in manuscript form at one time. When I would hit a block, I would go to another project, and it would call out loudly to me. And so I've continued to do that, but also recognizing, at a certain point, there's nowhere else to turn in terms of your own work. So I turn to the work of others. I read my way out of blocks a lot of times, and sometimes that reading is the reading I do as a teacher. I happen to be, I work with these extraordinary students, and a lot of times I get great nourishment out of what they're doing, thinking about things that in ways that I wouldn't have thought about them at all, that lights up my own particular problem. I edit a journal, the Denver Quarterly, and I'm having that experience with that reading as well. And especially it's bringing me back to poetry in a very focused, determined way, and that's been really useful, reading out of the genre that I'm working in. And sometimes free writing can work, but it has to be, for me, free writing it has to be pretty closely linked to the project I'm working on. But say picking a voice, a focus of energy that I hadn't given any attention to before. Well, what does this one have to say? And looking elsewhere, basically. Always looking elsewhere. Yeah.
How long did your first book take to write?
The first, all of my first few books took, to finish, they took between 5 and 8 years. To do the first draft, in some cases, took 6 months or something like that. And it was a long, agonizing process to realize that the most exciting stuff was happening in the revisions. And it was that long gestation and revising and relooking, and as I was describing, looking at other things, other projects. That was really where the discoveries were being made. And so I actually have the first draft of Indiana, is an 8-page story, which I still have. And that one was about building from, and it has the beginning, the middle, and the end, such as they are in that book. But it was all built from the inside out over a period of 8 years. And then in other cases, like the Exquisite, my third novel, was about a 130-page sort of ambiance piece, an extended meditation on this particular character, who sits at the center of Rembrandt's The Anatomy of Lesson. He's the corpse at the center of that painting. Aris Kint was his name. It's kind of a meditation on that character. And then over the course of the next few years, I turned it into something more resembling a novel. So it depends, but they take a while. That isn't to dishearten anyone in this business of 8 years. You have to wait 8 years. My closest friend in graduate school finished his first book in about 7 or 8 months. It just depends on how you're geared. Yeah.
Entering into the topic and genre of Civil War and Anglo-America, issues like slavery, what was your inspiration to enter into that topic as a writer, and then also how do you deal with such a complicated, civilizational topic in America?
Sure. That was my undergraduate degree was history, and in particular American history. And I almost went and actually, and I still regret to this day, I was accepted into McGill's history PhD program to do Native American history, but the writing thing took me and yanked me, and I went in that direction. So it's been on my mind for a while, and my senior thesis as an undergraduate was on the causes and consequences of the Haitian Revolution. So this idea of slavery and revolt has been in my head for a long time, but finding the way to write about it was really the question. And I think I had to figure out a lot of things about what I wanted to do with writing, not in a sort of articulated way, but in an intuitive way, before I could turn back around to some of these early things that I was passionate about and find a way to write about them. And the question of how you do it and how you handle it. In the case of Kind One, it was really important to me, I was talking about this earlier, that the book not be neat, that it not be clearly structured. You sort of imagine the acrobat who does the move and then lands gracefully and then people applaud. It just couldn't be that, right? This talking about slavery and putting it into a kind of container that one could hold and say, here it is. So it had to be something that wasn't sort of deliberately messy, but just spoke to the complicated nature of this this institution, this horrid institution that still is. I mean, I went to see 12 Years a Slave 2 days ago, and it's sort of amazing that it's taken so long to put on screen something that speaks to the brutality, enduring brutality of it. But there it is. It's still something that we're dealing with and wrestling with, and it seems to me worthy of our attempts to engage with, even if we fail, to take on these topics. I had a mentor, Peter Warshall, an anthropologist recently deceased, who impressed on me, not that I should do this, but that the idea that to him it was important that writers had taken on these difficult, as he put it, difficult topics, difficult subjects, that they probably weren't up to the task of wrapping their arms around, but that they had engaged with. And I suppose it took me a long time to figure out that maybe this was something that I needed to try and engage with these things. So it was a complex cocktail of things. But there will be the Civil War book, and then there's another one that's in the works dealing with these 19th century and some of these challenging issues that are still unraveling. Well, thank you all for your